Hey everybody. Around 20 years ago, I started my first journey to the Dark Tower, and I finished it in around 2005 with the publication of Book 7, The Dark Tower. And since then, I've plowed through everything else in the Stephen King bibliography, and I'm excited to go back and revisit The Dark Tower for the first time in almost 2 decades. So I am currently on book 3, The Wastelands, and I've thoroughly been enjoying this new experience where I'm at in my life now comparative to how I felt about the books the first time around. And in the next weeks and months to come, I will be posting some videos about my return journey to the Dark Tower. But the first thing I want to talk about, so my first journey to the tower, I read just books 1 through 7. The Wind Through the Keyhole, commonly referred to as book 4.5 because it comes between books 4 and 5, had not been published yet. That book I did, oh gosh, just last year, so that one is pretty recent. And I also picked up the novella Little Sisters of Eluria in 2002, 2003 or so in Everything's Eventual. I don't remember if I picked this book up as soon as it came out or later, but that was my first experience reading the standalone novella Little Sisters of Eluria, which, aside from the main books in the series, is one of the only works, or maybe the only other work, that actually features Roland as a main character, and I think is a really interesting addition to the series. So the first thing I had to decide is reading order. So did I want to go by publication date, which would be books 1 through 4, Little Sisters of Eluria, which originally came out in 1998 in an anthology called Legends, and then books 5, 6, and 7, and then Wind Through the Keyhole? Or do I want to go in chronological order based on when the stories are set? Or did I want to pull out one of my trusty trade editions of the later books, which famously include related works to the Dark Tower series in bold? Is this the way that I wanted to revisit the series? Did I want to read 8 books and a novella? Or did I want to read Salem's Lot, The Stand, Talisman, It, Eyes of the Dragon, Insomnia, Rose Madder, Desperation, Bag of Bones, Black House, From a Buick? Did I want to read all of those things again? So what I've decided to do in my reading order is go chronologically. It's not necessary to read Little Sisters of Eluria in any way, shape, or form to enjoy the series, just as it's not necessary to read The Wind Through the Keyhole. But any additional content, any additional pieces that fit into that puzzle are always welcome. And while I'm talking about additional pieces to the puzzle, I want to go back for a minute, revisit the topic of reading order, and sort of address this list of main works and related works. So according to that list, and this book is almost 20 years old, there are around 18 books that are connected to the Dark Tower. So what I have found is that a lot of those supporting books are actually sort of deep dives into certain characters that appear in the Dark Tower series. The Stand is a great example. You can read The Stand, totally enjoy it on its own merits. It is not required to read The Stand to read and understand and enjoy the Dark Tower series. Some of the works actually do more directly connect and to the Dark Tower series itself, and one of those that springs immediately to mind because I recently reread it is Insomnia, the much maligned mid-90s behemoth Insomnia. So in that work, In that work, characters from the Dark Tower series are prominently featured. So some of these supporting works are, they're still not required. Like, you can read, understand, enjoy the Dark Tower series without ever picking up Insomnia. But if you're making your way through the series and you're wondering, gosh, do I really need to read The Stand? How does that play in? Well, honestly, if you're just laser focused on the Dark Tower series, it's an interesting side journey in that overall process, but it doesn't have a lot of direct correlation to the events of the Dark Tower series. Maybe a character or two, hint, but not to the events. So I did want to kind of address that as well, circle back around. It can be very daunting to think, oh dear God, I have to read 18, 19, 20 books to get the full effect of this series, when in fact you could really just read the main series, books 1 through 7, and be just fine. Book 1, The Gunslinger, includes probably the most famous and perfect opening line of all of Stephen King's opening lines. The Man in Black, so famous I can't even remember how it goes. The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. And for people who've already read the series, that the idea of life as a wheel and destiny as a wheel that keeps turning around is very vital to the series. And that opening line is very vital to that roundness of the series. But book 1, The Gunslinger, the first time around, I found to be incredibly dry and hard to get into, even though it was the revised and expanded edition of the book, which is far more expansive and appealing to me than the original published in 1982. I still found it to be very dry and kind of a jarring entry into Roland's world. So having read the series before, I did decide to go chronologically, which means that I started with the Little Sisters of Eluria, which, as I mentioned, was originally released in an anthology in 1998 called Legends, which was right after book 4, Wizard and Glass, was published. It was collected in Everything's Eventual in 2002, and then eventually was featured in this beautiful slipcase illustrated edition from Grant, which gave them an opportunity to republish the revised and expanded version of The Gunslinger, which they had yet to do. So I figured if it's good enough for Grant to start with Little Sisters of Eluria and then segue into The Gunslinger, it would be good enough for me. And I highly recommend this entry point into the series, whether you've read the series before or not, but particularly if you've read it and you're considering a return journey, I highly recommend starting with Little Sisters of Eluria. It's a small and contained piece, but Little Sisters of Eluria has a very vividly drawn, compact cast of characters. It picks Roland up after the fall of Gilead, when he's officially out on his own, and I suppose the last gunslinger, but before he is caught onto the trail of the Man in Black. So he's younger, he's a little bit more reckless, potentially even foolhardy. He is able to be ganged up on and overpowered by a group of slow mutants, and then he is eventually rescued, seemingly, by a group of nuns who run a medical, like, Sisters of Mercy type hospital operation out of a tent in the middle of who knows where. But of course, there's more to the situation than meets the eye. and because it's Stephen King, things get pretty suspenseful. Things get a little scary, a little horrifying. At certain points, it's a really tight and compact reading experience. But I found that it was vital in helping set the stage for what comes next in The Gunslinger. I thoroughly enjoyed I enjoyed The Gunslinger very much, and I don't know if it's because I'm coming to it again 20 years later, or if it's because Little Sisters of Eluria, which was written in the late 90s when Stephen King was a much more mature and accomplished writer, just has that sort of newer style. I don't know. It's a different reading experience, but it really did help set the stage for what comes next. So what worked? Some of my favorite images, my favorite scenes from Little Sisters of Eluria, when you get an idea, a sense for the first time of what the little doctors are actually up to and what they can do and what they are doing, it's so delightfully creepy crawly, and just it really made my skin crawl and kind of turned my stomach. But it was fascinating and like very satisfying as well. The idea of these bugs that are used in these medical purposes. I know that there are real life examples of how those types of things are used, and while it's horrifying and disgusting, it's also oddly satisfying. And the fledgling doomed romance aspect to the story was also very welcome and very appreciated. There's just a ton of foreshadowing. So when the story first appeared in 1998, most people who encountered it had already read Wizard and Glass, and Little Sisters of Eluria does share a lot of points, characters, foreshadowing, or in the case of 1998, like going back to familiar characters. So if you're starting the series with Little Sisters of Eluria, you're going to learn more about Roland's backstory, which initially I thought could be a big spoiler for what comes later, but I feel like in the end that it really is effective foreshadowing for what comes later in the series. When it comes to what didn't really work, or what I didn't really buy, so I get that Roland, this is early in Roland's life. This is after the events in Wizard and Glass. It's before the events of The Gunslinger at some point in time. But Roland just seems more soft-boiled in Little Sisters of Eluria than, I mean, in The Gunslinger, even in Wizard and Glass, he's a boy, but he comes across as pretty tough and pretty savvy, pretty keen. By the time The Gunslinger comes along, at some point after Little Sisters of Eluria, Roland is basically like a walking, talking, chiseled hunk of leather, like Clint Eastwood in the spaghetti westerns, like if he was literally chiseled out of granite. So the mistakes that he makes, the sort of naivete that he kind of exhibits in parts, especially the beginning parts of Little Sisters of Eluria, I just found to be a little bit out of character. Thank you very much. This is a bit of a different thing, and I hope it's interesting. I'd love to hear more about. I'd love to hear about your experience with The Dark Tower. Do you love it? Can you not stand it? My grandma, big dyed-in-the-wool Stephen King fan, and she was not interested in what she called his fantasy westerns. And so I think that played a role in me not really digging into the series until I was a bit older, because she just wasn't interested at all. And that's okay. I know there's a lot of people out there like that, and there's a lot of people, The Dark Tower is just the ultimate absolute thing that Stephen King has ever written. I had a friend years ago who only ever read like fantasy, sci-fi, and not interested in Stephen King at all, but read the entire Dark Tower series, and that gave us something really interesting to talk about. I was surprised by that. So it can be a useful entryway, a door, if you will, between various worlds, various literary genres, and the people that read those genres almost exclusively. So anyway, tell me your thoughts, your experiences. Do you read, have you read Little Sisters of Eluria? Would you recommend putting it first? Where would you recommend slotting it in to the series? Have you read the series before? Have you not? Are you thinking about taking the plunge? I'm trying really hard. I will try really hard to make these videos mostly spoiler free, even though I have a feeling a lot of the people that watch these are people that are already familiar with these works. But I don't want to wreck all the surprises and give everything away. But anyway, thank you very much for your time and for your support of me and of the channel. I love getting your comments. I love getting emails, and I really appreciate it. So it's a beautiful thing, this community. But anyway, until next time, take care of yourself, and I will talk to you later. Bye.